Hello and welcome to IGPP Expert Talks. I'm Heena Goswami, editorial consultant with IGPP, Institute for Governance, Policies and Politics, New Delhi. At IGPP Expert Talks, we have been talking about issues that are going to shape the US presidential election. And today we talk about one issue that not only affects the American citizens, but to a certain extent the whole world, and that is the US economy. And to discuss the same, we are joined by Dr. 𝐄𝐜𝐸𝐲𝐧𝐶. Dr. East is Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Colorado, Denver. A Faculty Research Fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research, she is also a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution, a research fellow at the Institute for Study of Labor, and an affiliate of this Institute for Research on Poverty at the University of Wisconsin. In spring 2022, she also founded the Equitable Policy Research Lab. Welcome to IGPP Expert Talks, ma'am.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, throughout the election campaign, we saw that inflation, economy were some of the biggest talking points this season. And there was a lot of complaint about who did better during their presidency, and with Biden saying that Trump left the economy in such a bad state and they had to pick up the pieces and recover. Let's go back to the 2020 and the COVID time. Can you give us a brief insight into how the COVID pandemic hit the US economy, and has it recovered ever since? Do you think that recovery was also enabled by President Biden's measures such as the American Rescue Plan, and to what extent?
Sure. So 2020 feels like a long time ago, even though it wasn't that long ago. But what we saw in 2020 was really unprecedented in speed and severity number of job losses in the US. So millions of people lost their jobs in just a matter of weeks, which even in some of the worst previous recessions in the US, that really hasn't happened. So it was a pretty stark change in the economy because of the nature of the recession that happened because of the pandemic. And I would say it has taken us a long time to move towards recovery since 2020 in terms of the economy. And now it seems like we are getting back to so-called normal, to some of the basic, similar levels of employment, still high inflation, but lower inflation than we saw in the first few years of the pandemic. So I would say, yes, we are getting back to normal, but it's been a slow process. And I think we are still trying to figure out what the fallout from the pandemic-induced recession will be in terms of longer-term changes in work and changes in people's willingness to work, and who's working what jobs. So I think there's still more to learn as we move away from the pandemic.
Inflation has been really talked about this election, because that has like a real, if nobody understands economy, but everybody understands that groceries are expensive. And Donald Trump, former President Donald Trump, compared like size of Tic Tacs at a campaign rally to drive home the point about inflation. My question is that, is it only food inflation or gas prices that are, part of this inflation story? Or because of inflation, is it also impacting the quality of life of American citizens in long term? For example, I follow some American TikToks, not TikToks, that is banned, but YouTube shorts and stuff. And we hear a lot about how younger people are not able to buy homes, right? So is that part of the inflation story, or is it something different? How has inflation impacted the lives of ordinary citizens?
Definitely. I mean, it's such an important question, and I think it's one of the biggest deciding factors that we're going to see in this election is how people feel about inflation now and whether they have confidence that either of these potential presidential candidates can actually solve inflation, which I think there are big questions about. But I think that will be a really important motivating factor for a lot of people in the election this November. So in terms of just what has inflation looked like in the US, I agree, like it is very common to hear people talk about increases in food prices and gas prices, and those have gone up a lot and are really straining people's budgets, especially lower income households that spend more of their income on necessities like food and gas. Having the price of those things go up is going to hurt them more than higher income households that are able to adjust their budgets more to accommodate for changes in prices. So that's one thing that I do think is really important and is really truly affecting a lot of people, and has affected people's quality of life too, for sure. In terms of housing, we have seen both home sale prices and rental prices go up a lot since 2020. So home sale prices are up almost 50%, which is kind of shocking. And then rental prices are up 30%, which is a little better, but still not great. Given that, we have seen increases in wages in the past couple of years as well, but obviously we're not seeing 50% increases in wages for the average American. So buying a home, but even renting has become much more challenging for average Americans. And we're seeing it is a lot harder for people to buy their first home. Or even to move homes because of the dramatic increase in prices that we've seen in combination with high mortgage interest rates in the US right now. So that's a factor. But again, even among renters, we're seeing issues. So lots more adults are living with unrelated people. So a lot of like doubling up and a lot of roommates well into people's 30s and beyond, which is kind of a new phenomenon in the US. So that is definitely going on. I do think it's important, though, to recognize that while there has been this really dramatic increase in house prices, this has kind of been a trend for a long time in the US. We've kind of been setting ourselves up for a housing crisis, unfortunately, for a number of years. So even if you look pre-COVID, the rates of new construction were much lower post the Great Recession than they were pre-Great Recession. We kind of never really recovered in terms of building new houses after the Great Recession. And so we've been moving for a long time now towards a place where we don't have enough housing for the people that live in the US. And that's, maybe we'll touch on this later when we talk about immigration, but that issue of a housing shortage is true even without the issue of immigration. It's not that immigration is what's causing the housing shortage.
Let's talk of immigration, because immigration has been another hot topic this election, and we often hear like tag people, I mean, a lot of kind of people complaining that because the nation's resources are being spent on immigration, that's why there's not enough money to spend on its own citizens. How true is that point of view? Especially, we know for a fact that America has been built on the back of immigrant labor.
Yes, I think that's an important thing to acknowledge, is that, well, by definition, America is a country of immigrants, which has its own issues of colonization and taking away the rights and land of Native people in this country. But forever, we've been a country of immigrants, and we have always relied on immigrants heavily in the labor market. And that, I think, is becoming even more true over time. And so I think saying that immigrants are a drain to the country is incorrect. And really, it's a huge benefit to the US economy as a whole. And that's not to say that there are not some specific jobs that that US born people are losing because employers are able to find cheaper workers who are willing to accept lower wages because of their limited legal status. That's not to say that never happens, but taken as a whole, that is not the main story of immigration in the US. On the whole, we see that immigrants are huge contributors to the economy. They're super important in the labor market. They're super important to production and our overall GDP. And they help to actually create jobs for US born workers on the whole, rather than taking away jobs for US born workers.
My next question also relates to another complaint that we have heard about during this election season, that it is because the government is busy supporting one cause or one war or another in different parts of the globe. That's why it's another drain on the nation's resources. How true is that?
Yeah, no, that is something else that I think maybe is less discussed in the everyday lives of people here, but it is really important, I think. So, I mean, my sense is that, so as an economist, my sense is that, everybody has a budget, right? Even countries have budgets. Um, and while we can, run a deficit in the way that households, it's more irresponsible for a household to do than a country to do. It is true, especially that the deficit is weaponized against spending that is deemed unattractive by people in the US for a variety of reasons. So I think the most, stark example of this is that we're seeing cuts to key social services just kind of over the long term in the US, not right now necessarily, but we're seeing like a trend of cuts to important social services like public education and a strong social safety net to help people during times of hardship, and that a lot of the justification for those cuts in spending is the deficit and spending on foreign issues, foreign wars, etc. Is a big contributor to our spending overall in the US. And I would say is a much bigger factor in terms of what is driving how much we spend in the US relative to immigration.
America has always espoused the ideology of free trade and has looked down upon ideologies such as socialism, communism, and in the campaign also there were periods when one candidate said the other was socialist, and if they come into power, they're going to bring socialism to power. So this concept that that the government needs to take care of citizens is has not been one of the founding pillars of the nation. And it was only during the New Deal, which represented a new phase in American politics, where the government intervened to relieve the citizens of the impact of Great Depression. In political class, but has this idea that don't be a socialist, but maybe spend more to take care of the citizens. Has that become more accepted now? Because we saw a lot of debate over Medicare, and in the initial parts, there was allegations that it was one party or the other who had ruined Medicare for people. So has this idea become more common now that the government needs to intervene to take care of citizens?
I would say no. I think that the Medicare example is actually, in my mind, a bit of an outlier. So I do think it's important, but the people who benefit from Medicare are elderly primarily. And many of them are people who are not necessarily wealthy, but earned relatively medium to high incomes during their life. Um, and those people have a lot of political sway in the US, because they have a lot of time on their hands, and some of them have a fair amount of money. And so that is a group that both Democrats and Republicans work very hard to court every election cycle, and are very quick to blame each other for the failings of both Medicare, but also Social Security, which kind of benefits those same groups of people. So I think that the social services that we have for elderly people in the US are actually some of the best social services we have for any age group. And that's because they're such an important group politically. We really don't see similar concern or fighting back and forth between Democrats and Republicans about programs that serve working age populations or children, with either of the same, vehemence that we see with the elderly population. The New Deal is a pretty interesting, piece of American history, that I think really gets back to some of the things you were talking about in your question, which is the US has always said very strongly that we're a capitalist country and we're very against socialism and communism. But actually, a lot of what led to the New Deal was a pretty strong socialist movement in the US, and an attempt to basically quell a potential revolution, by having a compromise between business interests in the US and the Socialist Party in the US. And so that's how we got to that legislation that was so groundbreaking and feels so different than the rest of American history, because the New Deal is so hands-on in terms of intervening in the labor market and intervening in the economy and providing a lot of social services. And that feels, for me, and I think for a lot of people in the US, like a very far away possibility right now. It's hard to imagine another sweeping piece of legislation in that direction in the current era. I feel like we're moving in the opposite direction, if anything.
Uh, what differences do you see between the economic visions that candidates are espousing this election season? Um, they have somewhat talked about economy. I gather there was a rally where Donald Trump had gathered people just to talk about economy, but it went into another direction. And Democratic nominee Kamala Harris did release a document detailing her economic plan. What concerns does she touch upon, and how hopeful does that make you?
Yeah, I mean, I think a piece of a point of frustration among economists, but maybe just a lot of Americans right now is a lack of details from both candidates. So it's, I agree that Kamala Harris' economic plan is probably the most detailed thing we've seen from her campaign. But there's just kind of a lack of information that makes it a little bit hard to assess, I would say. Her rhetoric and sort of the broad discussion points in her plan and Harris's plan are, I think, very focused on issues around sort of economic pain for what we would think of as the average American. She talks a lot about the middle class, which I think it's a little unclear to lots of people what exactly that means, but trying to think about issues that affect the sort of everyday budgets of American families, that are not necessarily wealthy. And so she talks about reducing inflation. She talks about tax cuts for relatively lower income families. And I think that there's a lot of appetite for that in the US. I think there's a lot of interest in reducing inequality. I think there's a lot of interest in just, uh, helping people helping people be able to buy their first home, make ends meet, pay their bills, get the healthcare they need, send their kids to college, all of those things that have become relatively hard to do for a lot of people in the US in the last couple decades. And so I think that there is excitement about that. I think that there's also, at least in my mind, some skepticism about whether those things are actually possible to be achieved and whether she'll work for them once elected or if elected. So I think that there's the potential to do some good policy making that would help the just economic situation of average Americans, but a lot of unknowns as well.
Throughout the series, we have talked about like how there seems to be a polarization in the American society today, and that's over question of culture wars and immigration, climate change. And then I was told that, the difference is not over policy issues. It goes a little bit deeper, and the difference is of a population that has maybe gone to college and another that has not gone to college.
Mm.
I want to relate this to the question of free trade, of America being a capitalist society that we were talking about. So free trade has been foundation, but do you think free trade in public goods such as education, healthcare, has it divided American society into two halves and caused a lot of resentment among those who think that maybe they did not get the good end of the deal, and that is sort of contributing to polarization that we see today?
Yeah, this is a really good question that I feel like one could spend a whole career studying, honestly. I think it's really important, and it is something um, that has been changing, I think, in the US. I mean, truly, I think it kind of goes back to like the civil rights movement in the US. So we saw, I mean, kind of what we're talking about the New Deal, like we saw kind of a movement towards a little bit more government intervention, um, and strengthening workers' rights and, having a stronger safety net and opening all these public universities to promote higher education and giving veterans, rights to buy their first home and go to college and all of this very like pro-social legislation. And then I think the civil rights movement, while obviously the right thing, has led to a lot of backlash in the US, because now all those services that I just mentioned are not just for white people. They're for non-white people as well. And there's just a lot of like racism, whether it's, overt or not in the US, and a lot of feelings that, white people don't want to share those social services with non-white people. And that instead, they're willing to sort of go outside what is publicly provided. So go outside of the public school for their children that's in their neighborhood and send their kids to private school where there's less racial diversity. And I think that sort of movement has really undermined a lot of investment in public goods in the US, so including education, but also healthcare, and sort of a desire to protect, a desire among white people to protect their access to these high quality services. But if we have white flight, which we have had, and people are taking, I keep thinking about the education example because I feel like it's the most salient. Like if all white parents are taking their kids out of school and sending their kids to private school, that cuts the like resources significantly for the public schools. And then we're in this kind of situation that you described where we have, people who are kind of using the public services, and then people who have enough money and have the resources and have the access to use completely privatized versions of those services. And I think that's a really big issue, that I don't know. I don't know that we have figured out or anybody has figured out the solution to, but I think that that is a big challenge right now in the US. And I think that's also a big reason why my answer to your sort of political class interest in the welfare of its citizens question was the way that it was, is that we've really moved away from a society where there's an investment in citizens as a whole.
Has it also been the case with higher education, college level degree? Was it always expensive, or now that because some people are moving away from it, so has the investment become like really even more expensive now?
There's a big divestment in public higher education in this country right now. And that was like an intentional plan by Republicans. You can Google it, you can read about it, to cut both state and federal funding for public higher education. And so as a result of that, now higher education institutions, including like the ones that I work at, which is a public institution, are increasingly reliant on not public money, but rather tuition and donations as main sources of revenue. So because we're becoming so reliant on tuition as an important source of revenue, the university has to raise tuition in order to make up for the lack of public funds that we used to get and we're not getting now.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and
Yeah.
it was so fun talking to you, and all the things were easy to understand, even because economy always scares people away, even when they're complaining about it all the time. So, thank you so
Yes, happy
much.
to join.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.